Prisoners talking blues. It is impossible to separate the fate reserved for prisoners inside the walls from the conditions reserved more generally for the mass of poor people in society. This is what the wave of uprisings of May 1985 has shown. Uprisings carried forward especially by the accused awaiting judgment and developed solely in judiciary prisons. The penitentiaries did not stir, but among the prisoners awaiting judgment, quite a few are certain to be sentenced to long punishments and will end up there. The majority of the insurgents are part of the category of the accused, who will end up being sentenced to at least as much time as they have already served before sentencing. These are petty criminals, who we have the greatest chance of meeting outside. The revolt that resounds in the prison walls is a continuation of the one that resounds outside, in neighborhoods on the outskirts, and is a consequence of its repression. In France, 1985, only prisoners have still continued to have rebellious hearts and spirit. Those on the outside who still avoid the general annihilation recognize themselves, due to the force of circumstances, in the rebellion of the prisoners. Due to the contents of this revolt, they can only attribute a universal significance to it. One thing is indeed certain: the revolt against prison is now flaring up on the outside as well. The wave of revolt was directed in the same way against prison and justice. Up to that time, prisoners attacked the penitentiary institution. Now they also attack the judiciary institution. Before, they rebelled against the execution of punishment. Now they also protest against the way in which they are treated by a society whose general interest is represented by justice. Supporters of the state consider the insubordination of prisoners more dangerous, the more it threatens to blow up the entire system of law, which constitutes the keystone of the state apparatus and the safety valve of bourgeois society. This is why it is logical that prisoners' revolt would find an echo outside. Our aim is not exactly that of supporting on the outside the demands formulated inside for the improvement of some details of the prison regime. It is not that we turn up our nose at such demands, since we know how things go in prison. Above all, we seek to fight against the idea of imprisonment itself. We want to succeed in the destruction of these damned institutions. Therefore, we can encourage and take up every sort of demand that contains the only vital demand: air. Being among those who risk prison, we completely reject its fatality. For us, poor people who aspire to practical wealth, it is difficult to find words to express our rebellion and our aspirations in a clear way. That is, words for understanding each other. The enemy's strategy is twofold: making sure that the poor are distracted from questions of primary necessity and go to tilt at windmills, and in this way preventing them from meeting and discovering common tensions. The majority of explanations that one is permitted to hear about the prisoners' revolt are false, simply because they speak the language of the state, the law. The function of this chattering is so that the poor, in this case prisoners, are no longer even able to find the words necessary to express their dissatisfaction and rebellion, so that they are not able to dialogue, because they only know how to express themselves in the language of their masters. The aim of the supporters of the state and the defenders of the present society is to cause the poor to no longer know how to talk unless they are addressing their masters. Anyone who speaks the language of right speaks to the state and only to the state, solely on the basis of its reason. This lie, which doesn't just date back to yesterday, has the purpose of once again civilizing the insubordination of the poor. The fact is that a modern capitalist country cannot be governed with pure force, putting tanks at every street corner. The same is true for the maintenance of order in prisons. A modern state is constrained to guarantee all the formal liberty necessary to the smooth functioning of business. Two important capitalist countries, Argentina and Brazil, recognized this last year. The South American bourgeoisie is also on the verge of realizing it. A capitalist country cannot prosper by shooting the poor as soon as they get restless. To make them participate with their labor in the wealth of society, it must make them speak only its language and fill their heads with universal and abstract concepts that are really those of bourgeois society. It is necessary for them to identify with the general interests of society, and this is precisely the historical enterprise of the bourgeoisie, to be successful at doing this. Every modern state has the imperative to civilize the wild ones, the poor, including those who it has isolated from society in its prisons. The battle of ideas therefore rages on this front. The supporters of the state know that they will gain the upper hand over the prisoners' revolt, not so much due to mere force, which they are compelled to make use of at an early time with the risk that entails, but rather through pseudo-dialogue, through deception. This is why we must make supposed questions of legal right become social questions, causing the operation currently tried by the most modern supporters of the state to fail. As a former prisoner recently said about penitentiary administrators, they always try to make you participate in your own punishment. This is dialogue. There are no other possible forms of it. There is even a figure who specializes in the matter, the social worker. The thing called social work has its origins in the practices of the Church. Historically, it is born from the exchange of charity for penitence. Social workers are secular priests who preach for the state. All the thought that currently dominates the judiciary and prison system goes in this direction. They even dream of giving prestige back to the condition of prison guards, conferring upon them the label of educator. Once the penitence inflicted on the prisoner was not nearly so ambiguous. It was physically very hard. It is enough to read the frightful accounts made by the survivors of the punitive bath. Now it is claimed to be moral and also, so to speak, spiritual, although it conserves the basis of the prison system and the violence that entails. Many die in French prisons. The repressive system is weighed down with a moral content. It is even supplied with justifications. Its aim is, moreover, that of filling people's heads and preventing the people involved in rebellion, that is now chronic in prisons, from being able to find their own words. The people currently responsible for repression seek to provoke and feed an endless pseudo-dialogue about multiple improvements that could be introduced into the prison regime, all in order to justify it. It is an indirect way of convincing the prisoners of the validity of punishment. The state is convinced that it has a greater chance of managing this by combining pseudo-dialogue with repression, the physical violence of which is no longer enough in itself. By refusing the very concept of punishment, the imprisoned delinquents start to openly accept what they are in society. The prisoners are aware that a penal code belongs to its time and to the state that corresponds to the current society. The same goes for the penal procedure. Reformist consciousness is always expressed in the form of justification. Contrarily, the behavior of the rebels appeared unjustifiable, like the destruction carried out in Fleury on May 5, as it does its only declared reason, air, which cannot be negotiated with the state. When prisoners start challenging the justice of which they have been the object, prison ceases to be suffered as a fatality. There's a footnote here I'll read at the end of the paragraph. Continuing, leftist educators who try to justify delinquents, finding some excuse for their crimes, just make us sneer with scorn. One is already forced to justify oneself as a defendant before the judge. Besides, it is understood that if one tries to explain oneself too much, one ends up losing. The same thing happens when one is stopped by the police. And perhaps it is still necessary to be justified as prisoners. The rebels know that they have no admissible reasons from the point of view of those who judge them. Before the state, silence is truly the weapon of the poor. A footnote here. Thus, it is increasingly common in courtrooms to witness behaviors of open rebellion on the part of the accused who refuse the claim of the judge and jury to judge them. We recall that in 1984, 2 people accused of robbery in 2 separate instances, at the beginning of their hearing in the Court of Assize in Paris, one after another refused to be judged by the repugnant presiding Judge Gris, the same one who had absolved the no less repugnant police officer Eberhardt, killer of 2 young motorists, in the preceding hearing. The refusal of the accused caused a procedural crisis of sorts in the Court of Assize of the Seine. More recently in Nice, the Guillaume brothers created a fine disorder. 2 brothers accused of having committed a robbery with seizure, who had to appear Monday and Tuesday before the Court of Assize of the Maritime Alps, have refused their lawyers since the opening of the hearing, forcing the court to postpone the trial to a new date. Michel Guillem, 26 years old, and his brother Roland, 37, suspected of carrying out an armed robbery on October 9, 1980, at the Central Post Office of Antibes, vehemently criticized the justice of the rich in bulk. Their lawyers, who need this putrid justice in order to live but don't denounce it. Journalists, always under orders. And the police charged with keeping an eye on them, who only await a gesture from them to shoot them down like rabbits. Quoted from Liberation, September 24, 1985. At the end of a long suspension of the hearing, the court decided to designate 2 official lawyers and to reschedule the debate for October 7. 3 weeks later, they refused to witness the trial. Obviously, one cannot allow oneself such an attitude unless one is being judged for a very serious or a very minor crime. If one has nothing more to lose, or if one has very little to lose. On another occasion, in the spring of 1985, a group of Lyonnese punks succeeded in making a mockery of justice. While one of them was being tried for sneak thieving in a sleeping car, his friends distributed a flyer in the hall entitled, "No mercy for sneak thieves, cut off their hands." When the judge proposed a TIG, travail d'intérêt général, an added punishment that provides for hours of work in a few associations that have agreements with the state, the defendant gave the clearest refusal. In the end, he was sentenced to 15 days, suspended. Moreover, as far as we know, it is the first time that anyone has had the dignity to refuse a TIG. Perhaps this is the same group of punks that had the delightful idea of putting the manifesto, "Du fric ou vous tuez," your money or your life. See Os Cangaceiros No. 1. To music in Lyon. We also recall the mass movement of demands for provisional liberty that originated in Lyon last year and threw judges into confusion and panic, which arose again in September 1985 in the Baumet prison in Marseille. In prison, there are all kinds of individuals, but prisoners are most of all delinquents that society has decided to isolate. The term delinquency should not lend itself to confusion. It is chronically used to describe a set of behaviors that share the ephemeral shattering of social restraints and contempt for the law, as well as other people's property. Society uses this term to identify the youth who goes dancing on Saturday night in order to fight, the housewife who steals at the supermarket, the kid who turns into a robber, the worker who takes materials away from his factory, or who, more directly, sees no way to survive but to steal. All the people who, on varying levels, it can no longer completely integrate. It is a time in which work and the law are no longer sacred in the eyes of many poor people. Delinquent, from the Latin delinquere, to take away, as one's due, delinquere, to leave out, delinquent, from the present participle delinquens, delinquency, 10. If the individual has rights, it is because she has duties. If she fails in these, she cannot seriously demand her rights in society and before the state, except in view of repentance on her part, paying her debt in a specific fashion by working for a few coins while suffering her punishment, and giving evidence of her desire for rehabilitation. By having conditional or partial liberty, the individual is judged a second time, this time on the basis of her concrete desire for rehabilitation. If she decides to work for rehabilitation, she can hope to be exempted from a portion of the misfortune that strikes prisoners, conserving whatever effective right. The state understood quite quickly, since the first uprisings of 1971 and 1974, that it was not necessary to isolate imprisoned individuals completely from civil society. If necessary, it forces the condemned to earn the right to re-enter it anew. This is not the least despicable thing. Anyway, civil society already has its entrances into prisons. Prisoners often work. But it enters prisons on the basis of a particular methods reserved for socially unworthy individuals. Since prisoners are outside the mechanism of integration into this society, the rate of exploitation of their labor can be permitted to be especially high, and their wages especially low. All sorts of people claim to be interested in the insubordination of prisoners. Many of them, the reformists, demand that society acknowledges the prisoner's assertion of their rights. But what are these rights? Rights of defense? But these only apply to the object of judgment. not to the execution of the sentence. Prison is a closed universe in which there can be no place for contradictory debate. Human rights and citizens' rights. Human rights are recognized privileges and safeguards of the atomized individual of a bourgeois society in which there is room only for two kinds of individual: those who make money and those who work. How could we, who do not enrich society but rather cost it money, think of benefiting from these privileges and safeguards? By virtue of what social activity in which we could take pride? Citizens' rights? The citizen is the political individual, i.e., the abstract individual. The prisoner is not a citizen. On the one hand, there is the effective member of bourgeois society, the isolated and limited individual that this society considers the essence of the human being. On the other hand, there is the moral person, the citizen. It is important to distinguish, methodologically, between the moral person, the accused, the condemned, and the real individual who is imprisoned. Here, the member of society is the individual who has not fulfilled her duties toward the rules that society has democratically established. The moral person is the accused, who is given the honor of recognizing a right to defense. The accused is a citizen. As judged and condemned, nothing remains to him except to suffer his fate in prison. He cannot then take advantage of any right, since it doesn't contribute to the wealth of society with any work, except for that which he is obligated to perform, forced by poverty and regulation. The state is logical when it refuses to permit the possibility of prisoners' unions. It only offers one road to prisoners. This is to pass through its hell on earth, enduring, accepting punishment, suffering, and humiliation, in silence, and completely mending their ways through prison labor. Secular in theory, religious in practice, justice and the prison system are made in the image and likeness of the bourgeois class. Rehabilitation from that hell on earth is granted to the prisoner who passes through it in silence, without having anything to say, neither raising his voice, nor complaining, much less protesting. The Christian ideal is still interiorized by many people in prison. The worst thing that one must endure in prison is this feeling of complete dependence on the rules, clearly aimed at taming the individual. Prison has a semblance of re-education. It is school and barracks at the same time, as is very obvious, for example, in England, and even more in the sadly famous camps of some Stalinist countries. The jailer's abuse of authority is just an expression of the authority of the regulations. In this sense, the state tries to completely recuperate a few individuals over whom, at a certain point, the control of civil society did not serve adequately. Therefore, it needs to impose rules on them by force. In this sense, the prison evokes the barracks, where the individual ends up being bent to the primary rules of society, obedience, and discipline. The condition of the soldier and that of the prisoner have this in common. They are individuals whose fate depends entirely upon the state, to the point of having to suffer the abuses of hierarchy without complaining. Despite all the privileges and concessions the prison administration might concede, and it is well known to be rather stingy in this, there will still be spontaneous rebellions of prisoners in the face of regulation. As for the accused awaiting trial, she has not yet been the object of moral judgment. She is kept in a safe place, completely at the disposal of the state. It can never be repeated enough that to this extent the condition of the accused is like that of the hostage. Furthermore, it should be mentioned that England, which made French reformists drool with its habeas corpus, introduced temporary detention into its penal procedures in 1980, i.e., when the social war had taken a few steps forward. One could note in passing that, no matter what the humanitarians of the left claim, prison will always remain a place of absolute unworthiness, as is shown by recent government regulations that try to bypass it for the petty criminal, the one who is not completely excluded from society, because for now she has only committed crimes of little significance and is capable of reintegrating into the social system thanks to her job. It is up to her, however, to give proof of this by carrying out X hours of work in the general interest. The state will always be able to grant some improvements in the particulars of the daily life of prisoners, but it will never be able to grant them the least bit of dignity. Prison discipline will always have the final word. The demand to grant the prisoner the same rights as the accused, such as that of getting help from his lawyer before the tribunal inside prison, has no possibility of being granted, inasmuch as the prisoner is not a moral person like the accused. The prisoner is a real individual, unworthy of society. Reformists demand that prisoners be granted social dignity, in other words, human rights. But of what does this dignity consist? It is what bourgeois democracy recognizes in the worker. Of course, prisoners are sometimes workers and are paid very poorly. The prison administration is in charge of selling their labor power to various contractors and makes money from it. After all, the prisoner is its burden and is quite expensive. If a normal wage were granted to the prisoner, then the greater part of it would be held back from him for maintenance expenses, withdrawn by the prison administration for legal expenses, fines, and the compensation he would have to give the victims of this crime as well. To what extent do the poor have any rights, civil or political, in civil society? To the extent of their duties. Civil society describes the totality of the system of needs and jobs. The poor participate in it only because, due to circumstances, they are forced to concede the exploitation of their labor to others who make money from it. The true need that the social system produces and reproduces for everyone is the need for money. The poor experience it exclusively in the form of lack, due to necessity. Only the bourgeoisie have a positive relationship with this essence of society, the relationship of the poor to its work. Of course, bourgeois democracy proclaims that everyone is free to profit, acknowledging anyone's right to do business. Thus, each one can make his way in the world, but only one world exists, that of business. And modern bourgeois society, which we see in Europe, the USA, and Japan, allows many poor people to be fooled into thinking that they are profiting. The constraint that is exercised over the wage worker and the necessity that defines all his needs within the same limit are thus transfigured in the language of society. The most savage reign of necessity is magically transformed into its opposite, and this is how motivated workers, satisfied and reimbursed consumers, responsible voters, and even prisoners who pay their debts to society exist. The necessity of money reigns through a multitude of legal relationships that clearly perpetuate themselves through constraint, and every form of dissatisfaction that expresses itself constitutes a violation of these relationships. Society responds to this with more extreme constraint. Prison. One who doesn't work is a damned one. Prison isolation is added to the isolation that already defines the atomized individual of civil society. The imprisoned delinquent is thus made the object of real social damnation, which is also expressed in the relative indifference witnessed in the face of prison revolts. If, at minimum, all former prisoners and those who have imprisoned relatives were to start supporting the revolts by attacking cops from behind, like someone tried to do in Rouen and Montpellier in May 1985, all these people are unaware of being a social danger, and sometimes all they would need to do is comprehend this in order to truly become so. The state treats delinquents en masse as a social danger, but demolishes them one by one. The law knows only the single individual that it crystallizes as an abstraction before society, but it is really because he is concretely in society that a poor person is judged. But if the delinquent is judged as an isolated individual, prisoners rebel as a collective subject. Once inside the walls, the reason why one has ended up there is of little importance. All are there together, in the same shit and treated in the same way. Prisoners rebel against a common fate. Whatever the specific reasons for the revolts may be, they will not be exhausted in any reform or improvement of details, because in prison it is always necessary to demand the smallest thing that one could work out for oneself on the outside. And, in such a desolate universe, the smallest thing takes on an enormous importance and can furnish the occasion for a rebellion. The occasions will never be lacking. It is understood that the prison administration is able to impose calm for a time as a consequence of repression combined with some improvements, but the calm is not destined to last for long. This social critique of rights could only arise from inside the prison's sense. Even though justice condemns individuals one by one, the fate of each one being her own private affair, it then locks them up altogether. And it is there that the conditions are created for a revolt directed specifically against the authority of the prison administration, the conditions of imprisonment, and more generally against a social system that is based on prison. It is from there, and in retaliation to this collective rebellion, that a movement can emerge outside that not only recognizes itself in this human protest, but extends its development. Something that is not in one-sided opposition to the consequences, but rather in open conflict with the presuppositions of the state itself. Workers in struggle can fight to demand a wage increase. In the same way, prisoners can manage to obtain reductions in punishment through their actions. Prisoners don't struggle for a general reform of prison conditions, just as workers on strike don't concern themselves with a reform of work. They leave those concerns to union bureaucrats. The only thing that prisoners in revolt can reasonably demand within the limits of the existing system is a bit of air. Reforms are made anyway, always in order to quench the smoldering fire. What has been obtained for improving the prison regime has always come at the end of a test of strength with the state. Prisoners also know from experience that the advantages extracted under the threat of the worse are often quickly transformed into a further disgrace once calm has returned. The insubordination of prisoners always takes on the character of a universal threat, since it has to do with individuals who have been locked up in the name of the general interest of society. This is what transforms it into a significant political event every time. Each wave of rebellion leads to some project of reform of the laws and codes. The left, which had promised to modify the entire prison regime, hasn't even risked trying it. Once it came into power, it immediately understood that if it had done so, it would have been playing with fire. There is no improvement impossible in the regime of imprisonment except that of granting air to prisoners. The left knows that the smallest opening risks provoking disorder. Any type of government is sure to have hassles with prison. No matter what side one takes it from, he ends up getting his hands dirty. The notion of general interest is at the center of the entire system of legal rights against which the rebels fight. The state and its supporters continually refer back to this general interest, in contrast to the latent state of war that rages in real society. They are able to make people identify themselves with this supposed general interest, to the extent that, in France of 1985, any line of demarcation between the poor and civil society seems to be erased, and delinquency often takes its victims from among the poor. On the one hand, the place where money and goods always circulate in abundance are being transformed more and more into impregnable fortresses. On the other hand, the conditions to which those who work must submit are becoming more and more intolerable. Decidedly harsher conditions arise from this for those poor people who don't work, increasing the isolation of each one in her search for money. And the spread of heroin among the youth aggravates this process even more. The state and the bourgeoisie erect a system of military defense of private property, of the circulation of money and commodities, unleashing at the same time the war of all against all, the fiercest conflict of isolated interests. The authority of the state thus finds its basis again in the confused hostility that reigns over society in its totality. Then, the prisoners' revolt appears as a possibility for overcoming this state of affairs. The protest against justice and prison crystallizes the general interest of all the poor, subdued by necessity and what they must bear under various forms, the repression practiced in the name of general interest of society. Solidarity with the revolts doesn't appeal to sentiment any more than it speaks to so-called public opinion. We have simply wanted to speak to the prisoners, and the fact that their rebellion has been strong enough to find such a response outside is not the least of its merits. Yves Deloisy.
Les chacals sont affamés et ne se contentent pas des ordures. Je cours plus vite que mon souffle me le permet en vérité.